He was just an old cop with a limp and two loyal dogs. But when a patient started dying mysteriously in a quiet town, they uncovered a truth no one dared speak aloud, a truth buried deep inside the very hospital meant to save lives. And when the lights went out, only the dogs knew who the killer was. Stay with us to witness a story of loyalty, silence, and courage, because what happens next will restore your faith in heroes with paws. Ashridge, Oregon greeted the morning with the crisp hush of early autumn. The sky was a sleepy gray brushed with the pale gold of rising sun, and the small town still clung to its fog like an old shawl. The scent of pine and morning dew wrapped around the brick storefronts lining Main Street were little stirred besides a crow pecking at an old soda cup. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your dog's name before they remembered yours, and where news spread faster than the mail truck. Officer Frank Weller climbed out of his worn patrol SUV parked outside the Ashridge Police Department. A round man in his early 50s, Frank bore a bald head, polished smooth by time, and a thick salt and pepper beard that seemed to speak before he did. He moved with the slow but steady steps of someone used to weight both physical and emotional. Once a rising star in the Portland force, he'd transferred to Ashridge after his wife passed away a decade ago. The city noise had become unbearable, and the silence of small-town life felt at the time like healing. Flanking him were his two loyal companions, Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with disciplined posture, a narrow snout, and intelligent amber eyes that scanned every shadow as if he were already writing a report in his head. And Sunny, a 4-year-old golden retriever whose floppy ears bounced as she trotted beside them, her golden coat glowing with a warmth that matched her nature. Ranger was all precision and restraint, a former airport detection dog reassigned to patrol work. Sunny, on the other hand, had been trained for therapy and emotional response. While Ranger watched the world for threats, Sunny watched people for their pain. Their routine was simple morning walkthrough of the main district, a swing past the edge of town near the woods, then an hour at the old training grounds behind the abandoned mill. Frank approached the crosswalk near Juniper Avenue when a voice called out from a nearby doorway. "Mornin', Frank." It was Ted Jenkins, a retired mechanic who ran a junk shop that smelled permanently of gasoline and old coffee. Ted was wiry, missing a few teeth, with eyebrows like untrimmed hedges and a laugh like crumpled aluminum. "Them pups gonna sniff out another squirrel cartel today." Frank gave a dry smile. "If there's a black market in acorns, they're already on the case." They exchanged a few more words before Frank moved on. As they passed the rusted gate of the abandoned Ashridge paper mill, a hulking skeleton from the town's better days, Ranger's head jerked. He let out a low growl. Frank followed the dog's gaze to a boarded-up window where a faint movement could be seen inside, just a flicker like a shadow recoiling from light. "Easy, boy," Frank murmured. He unlatched the gate and led both dogs through the gravel lot. The ground was soft with moss, the scent of mold, and something acrid rising from the building. Inside, the broken concrete floor was littered with empty soda cans, boot prints, and a chemical tang that clung to the nostrils. It wasn't strong, but Ranger's tail stiffened. Frank turned on his flashlight and scanned the far wall. Nothing. Whoever had been here was long gone, but something wasn't right. He crouched and found a small shard of glass tucked behind an old pallet. Inside it held a trace of blue powder. Ranger barked once, sharp and alert. Sunny whimpered, pawing at Frank's side. He stood, pocketed the shard in an evidence bag, and stepped outside into the fog. They returned to the station, and Frank logged the incident. There was no official case, no suspect, no victim, no crime. But instincts he'd learned were worth more than evidence sometimes, and Ranger never barked without reason. Across town, Lana Brooks finished her shift at Ashridge General. A 26-year-old nurse with a lithe frame and calm hands, Lana had recently moved to Ashridge from Eugene to care for her mother, who suffered from early-onset Parkinson's. Lana's long brown hair was usually pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her deep brown eyes held that quiet awareness that nurses often carry, the kind that watches everything even when nothing is being said. She had hoped small-town life would be slower, simpler, but she had begun to notice patterns. Patients arriving with unexplained symptoms, dizziness, nausea, fatigue, and always from the same part of town near the mill. The hospital's lead doctor dismissed her worries, but Lana couldn't shake the feeling. That evening, she walked home along Pine Creek Road, her mother's medication tucked under her arm. As she turned a corner, she paused at the sight of the old warehouse near the woods. A delivery van was parked behind it, unusual for that time of night. She squinted. A figure was loading crates into the building, moving quickly, glancing over their shoulder. Lana didn't say a word, but she took out her phone and snapped a picture. Back at home, she gently helped her mother, Marianne Brooks, into bed. Marianne was once a piano teacher, now slowed by shaking hands and a soft voice. "Everything all right, sweetie?" she asked, her tone slurred but tender. "Yeah," Mom Lana said, brushing her mother's silver hair back. "Just something's off in this town." Later that night, Frank sat on his porch with a cold cup of coffee watching Ranger pace the front yard. Sonny lay by his feet sighing now and then. His mind drifted back to that shard of glass, to the way the scent clung to his jacket even now. Something was moving in Ashridge, something under the surface, and his dogs knew it. Miles away in the back room of that same abandoned warehouse, a man in a lab coat locked a steel door behind him. He was tall with narrow shoulders and a scar just below his ear. On the table beside him, rows of vials shimmered in the dim light. He typed a message into a secure phone, shipment secured. No suspicion. Proceeding. He didn't see the paw print left faintly near the entrance, still damp from dew. But Ranger would remember the scent. The fog had mostly lifted by mid-morning, revealing a pale blue sky stretching over Ashridge. Sunlight filtered softly through the thinning branches of oaks and firs, dappling the streets in shifting gold. The town looked peaceful, almost untouched, but Frank Weller knew better. He had barely slept the night before, kept awake by the scent of chemicals clinging to his jacket, and the unshakable memory of that fleeting shadow inside the abandoned mill. Something about it all smelled wrong, and Ranger had smelled it too. At precisely 9:04 a.m., Frank's SUV rolled to a stop in front of the old bus depot on Holloway Street. The depot, closed for years, now served as a makeshift parking lot for out-of-towners. Frank had received an anonymous tip from a local shopkeeper, a quiet woman named Gail Monroe, who ran a thrift store across the street. Gail, in her early 60s, thin and stooped from decades of standing behind a counter, spoke little, but saw everything. She'd reported a jumpy man with dark hair and a large black duffel bag who'd been coming around every couple of days, loitering near the alley before disappearing toward the woods. Frank stepped out with Ranger and Sonny. As they neared the rear lot, Ranger's ears twitched. A man was indeed there, pacing nervously near a rusted bench. He was tall and wiry, with a sharp jawline and slicked back black hair that gleamed like polished stone. His jacket was too heavy for the weather, and the duffel bag at his feet bulged awkwardly. Frank approached with a slow, deliberate gait, hands loosely at his sides. "Morning," he said flatly. The man jerked his head up. His eyes were narrow gray and calculating. "Just passing through," he muttered. Frank gestured to the dogs. These two disagree. The man's name, as it turned out, was Miles Tucker, or so he claimed. He offered a driver's license from Nevada and said he was in town visiting an aunt who couldn't be reached by phone. Frank knew the name was likely fake, but lacking cause, he couldn't hold him. Still, he made note of the way Miles's grip tightened on the bag every time Ranger leaned close. "What's in the bag?" Frank asked. "Gym clothes," Miles replied too quickly. Frank gave a nonchalant nod, but the tension was visible. Before letting him go, he made a quiet signal to Sonny. The golden retriever circled Miles once, then gave a soft, rising whimper. Not an alert, just concern. Frank let him walk, but he wasn't done watching. Meanwhile, at Ashridge General Hospital, Lana Brooks sat at a metal desk in the cramped staff break room. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and her hair was messily tied back, but her eyes burned with focus. Spread out in front of her were her notes. 6 cases of unexplained symptoms over the last 3 weeks. Nausea, disorientation, arrhythmia. All patients had lived near the West Woods. None had a clear diagnosis. A knock at the door made her jump. It was Dr. Grant Holloway, the hospital's lead physician. In his late 50s, tall with silver hair and a kind but weary face, Dr. Holloway was known for his clinical precision and mild manner. He smiled thinly. "Lana, you've been working too hard again." She quickly closed her notebook. "Just reviewing charts." He nodded slowly, glancing at the papers. "Be careful. We don't want to spook patients with theories, especially with no clear evidence. Let the lab work tell the story." She watched him go, unease pooling in her chest. Grant had always been supportive, but there was something guarded in his tone. Later, she would recall that moment with clearer suspicion. That evening, as Lana sat by the kitchen window, sipping cold tea while her mother rested, her phone buzzed. A blocked number, no caller ID. Curious, she opened the message. It was a single sentence. "Stop asking questions if you want your mother safe." Her fingers trembled. She looked around, suddenly conscious of the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the darkness settling outside. At the same time, Frank returned to the station and filed his report. He uploaded the footage from Ranger's collar cam video, of Miles' time-stamped audio included. It wasn't much, but he had a gut feeling reinforced by decades of knowing when a man was hiding something. He was interrupted by Deputy Carla Jenkins, a blunt, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, with cropped blonde hair and a tattoo of a phoenix peeking from her sleeve. "Got something weird," she said, holding out a small container. "Guy at the motel turned this in. Says he found it in the trash can outside room 3. Inside the container was a used medical vial with no label, only a faint smudge and a dried residue of blue powder. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Get it to the lab." Quietly. "Same guy from the lot?" Carla asked. "Same jacket. Different lies." Ranger barked once from under the desk. Sunny lifted her head from Frank's boots and tilted her head, ears twitching. Back at home, Lana checked her locks twice before heading to bed. She sat beside her mother, who was dozing lightly. Her heart ached with the thought that someone might use her mother as leverage, but her fear had not erased her resolve. Instead, she opened a new document on her laptop and began typing a timeline of symptoms, names, dates, and now threats. Miles Tucker walked under the cover of darkness along the edge of the woods, the duffel bag slung across his back. He moved with a practiced quiet, stepping over roots and around fallen logs. Somewhere ahead, a dim light flickered in an abandoned cabin. He would not go back to the depot. The cop was too attentive. It was time to speed up the schedule. And in the backyard of a certain house on the hill, Ranger lay with his nose-lifted ears, straining toward the distant forest. Sunny whimpered in her sleep pause, twitching. Trouble was moving through Oshridge, quiet as fog, and the dogs knew it first. Ashridge's night fell like velvet, quiet and deep, with a sky sprinkled in stars that blinked down on the sleepy town. But under the starlight, something darker stirred beneath the forest canopy, where secrets lingered between pine trunks. The breeze carried more than the scent of damp earth. It carried traces of chemicals almost masked by moss and sap, but not to Ranger's nose. Frank Weller drove slowly along the gravel road that bordered the western woods, headlights sweeping over wild blackberry bushes and crooked fence posts. Sunny sat quietly in the back seat, head resting on the edge of the window, while Ranger stood alert in the front, his nose-twitching ears perked. Frank had intended only a routine loop, a chance to clear his head after the strange run-in with Miles Tucker. But Ranger had been restless all evening, circling the porch, growling low into the trees. It wasn't until the shepherd sat beside the door, tail-stiff eyes locked toward the dark tree line, that Frank had grabbed his keys. As the SUV neared a fork in the road, Ranger let out a sharp bark and pawed the dashboard. Frank slowed to a crawl. "You sure?" he muttered. The dog responded with a low, insistent whine. Frank turned left into an overgrown path, barely wide enough for the vehicle. Branches scraped the sides like skeletal fingers, and leaves whispered warnings. But Ranger pressed forward, pressing his weight against the windshield. They emerged into a small clearing behind a forgotten hunting cabin, its wood faded to gray roof, sagging under decades of neglect. Frank parked and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The air smelled wrong, sweet and metallic, the same scent that had clung to the broken vial Carla found. Ranger bounded ahead, nose to the ground, tail rigid. Sunny followed cautiously, ears drooped, whining softly as she stepped through puddles, reflecting the moonlight. Inside the cabin, dust hung in the air, disturbed by footprints too recent to ignore. Frank's beam flicked across a long work table, lined with flasks, tubing, and burners, makeshift lab equipment, most of it jury-rigged from hardware store parts. A notebook lay open on the table, written in a tight mechanical hand, chemical equations and acronyms he couldn't decipher. A tarp near the far wall was half covered in dirt. Ranger barked and started pawing at it. Underneath were empty canisters labeled with hazmat symbols and faded stickers from a biomedical company Frank didn't recognize. He stepped outside to radio it in his voice, low and urgent. "Unit 3 to dispatch. I have a probable chemical lab in the woods off West Mill Trail. Requesting backup and hazmat confirmation." There was a long pause followed by the cool voice of Captain Dwayne Mercer, Frank's superior. Mercer, a tall, gaunt man in his 60s, with a hawk-like face and a penchant for cigars, was known for doing things by the book, but whose book was often a mystery, acknowledged Weller. Mercer said, "I'll send someone by in the morning." In the morning, Frank blinked. "Sir, there's active material here. You might want to see it before someone burns it down. Stand down for now. You're out of jurisdiction. Let it go." The radio clicked off. Frank stared at it for a long beat, then muttered a curse under his breath. Ranger growled softly as if he understood. Sonny leaned against Frank's leg, shivering. He snapped a few photos of the setup and left the rest untouched. Meanwhile, Lana Brooks pushed her cart of medications down the hallway of Ashridge General, her eyes heavy from another double shift. The hospital smelled of bleach and coffee, and the dim lighting did nothing to soothe her nerves. She had been watching room 107 all evening. Inside lay Mr. Callahan, a 74-year-old stroke survivor with thinning gray hair and faded tattoos on his forearms. He rarely spoke, but always smiled when Lana checked on him. What caught her attention wasn't Mr. Callahan, but his newest visitor. A doctor in a long white coat, unfamiliar with a stiff posture, and a face half shadowed by the hallway lights. Lana hadn't seen him on the rotation sheets. His name tag read Dr. Rowe, but his voice was low and curt, his movements too rehearsed. When Sonny had visited the hospital for a therapy round last week, she had growled at the same man, then whimpered and retreated. It was subtle, but Lana noticed, and dogs didn't lie. Tonight Lana walked past, slowly watching through the corner of her eye as the doctor leaned over Mr. Callahan's IV line. She pretended to check her clipboard, then backtracked and tapped lightly. "Excuse me, doctor. I think you're in the wrong room." The man looked up. His face was clean-shaven skin, pale eyes gray, not unlike Miles Tucker. He gave a tight smile. "Mr. Callahan's glucose levels need adjusting. I've been consulted by Dr. Holloway." Lana smiled politely but took a mental note. Dr. Holloway was off shift. As the man left, she caught the faintest scent of ethanol and rubber gloves. She followed him discreetly to the side exit and watched as he disappeared into a black sedan parked in the staff lot, driving off without headlights. Back at her station, Lana opened her notes again and added a new entry. Dr. Rowe, possible alias for Miles Tucker. The next morning, Frank arrived at the station early, coffee in hand. Eyes bleary. Captain Mercer stood by the printer, arms crossed. "You filed a report about a lab." "Where's the evidence I sent photos?" Frank replied. "They weren't clear. Unless you want internal review on false reports, I suggest you stay in your lane." Frank bit back the anger. He'd seen too much to ignore. If the system wanted to pretend nothing was happening, he'd work around it. Later that day, he returned to the cabin site, but everything was gone. The lab equipment, the notebook, even the footprints all scrubbed clean. Ranger sniffed frantically, darting back and forth, but the scent was fading. Someone had moved fast. In the shadows of Ashridge, the game was changing, but Ranger had already marked the trail, and Sonny had already known who not to trust. The rain came early that morning, soft and steady, tapping gently against the hospital windows like a patient whisper. Ashridge was cloaked in silver mist, the streets slick with water, and the air heavy with silence. Inside, Ashridge General Hospital, the hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the sound of rolling carts and distant monitors. Lana Brooks moved quickly through the east wing, a flash drive tucked deep in her pocket, her nerves humming louder than the rain. 2 nights ago, Lana had planted a hidden camera just above room 107's hallway vent, a tiny black lens barely the size of a dime. The footage she retrieved this morning played like something out of a nightmare. The man posing as Dr. Rowe with that same sharp jaw and stiff demeanor entered Mr. Callahan's room at 3:12 a.m., holding a syringe. There had been no medical call, no logged orders, no witnesses. Mr. Callahan's vitals dropped within the hour, and now he lay in a coma, his eyes half open but blank. Lana hunched over a staff computer in the break room, rewound the footage again and again. The man's movements were calculated. No hesitation, no gloves, no hesitation in injecting a clear liquid from an unlabeled vial into Mr. Callahan's IV line. She paused on a frame, his face partly caught in a side glance. It wasn't perfect, but she was certain. Miles Tucker, or whoever he truly was. She considered going to hospital security, but she remembered how swiftly her last suspicions were dismissed. She thought about her mother sleeping one floor below. The text message still haunted her. Stop asking questions if you want your mother safe. Instead, she made a decision. She copied the footage to a separate drive, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote in pen across the front, "To be released if anything happens to me." She slipped it into a ventilation duct behind her locker, then straightened her scrubs and walked back to the ward, as if her world hadn't just shifted beneath her. Elsewhere, the rain turned heavier. Frank Weller stood by his cruiser parked at the edge of the ridge road, his hat pulled low and jacket collar turned up. Ranger was in the back seat, eyes locked forward, while Sunny pressed her nose to the window tail, low. Frank had received a tip, another anonymous text. It claimed that a figure matching Miles's description was heading toward an old silo near the North Railroad tracks. It could have been a trap, but he couldn't ignore it. As Frank stepped onto the muddy trail, the wind picked up howling between the trees like a warning. He moved quickly, flashlight bobbing in the dark. The trail curved around a drop-off near the river, steep and slick. Suddenly, a sharp noise behind him, twigs snapping, a rush of movement. He turned fast, gun raised. Then the ground gave way. The soaked soil crumbled beneath his boots. Frank fell hard, tumbling down the embankment, crashing into rocks and twisted roots. His head struck something solid. The world spun, once then turned black. Back at the cruiser, Ranger let out a bark that cracked through the storm. Sunny whimpered, then began scratching at the door. When no response came from Frank's radio, Ranger began pacing, growling low. It took him less than a minute to unlatch the gate and leap out. Sunny followed. Together they darted into the woods, paws pounding through wet underbrush. Ranger found Frank first motionless at the base of the hill, rain pooling in the folds of his coat. The dog nudged his hand, then barked fiercely into the wind. Sunny crouched beside them, her body trembling, licking Frank's face with soft desperation. When no help came, Ranger did something he hadn't done since his training days. He ran, through the trees down the main trail, across the slick grass of a small farmstead until lights appeared in the distance. He reached a passing pickup truck and jumped onto the hood, startling the driver, Marshall Reed, a retired postal worker in his 60s, round-bellied and always wearing flannel. Marshall slammed the brakes and got out rain, soaking his cap. "What in God's name?" Ranger barked, turning running a few feet, then back again. Something about the dog's desperation spoke louder than words. Marshall followed, calling 911 from his truck. Within 20 minutes, Frank was lifted onto a stretcher and rushed to Ashridge General, unconscious, his breathing shallow. Lana heard the ambulance before she saw it. As they wheeled Frank past, she froze. His face was pale blood on his temple lips, slightly blue. The dogs arrived with him. Ranger refused to leave his side, growling whenever the EMTs tried to move too quickly. Sunny whined softly, her body pressed against the stretcher rails. Lana stepped in, gently placing a hand on Sunny's head. "It's okay, girl. I've got him now." Frank was moved to ICU room 304. Ranger sat at the foot of the bed, ears high, unmoving. Sunny positioned herself by the door and growled low each time a doctor passed by, especially one with gray eyes and a long coat. Miles had come again. He wore different glasses now, a cleaner shave, but Lana recognized the arch of his brows, the odd stiffness in his stride. He tried to enter the room twice. Sunny blocked him both times, snarling softly. When Lana arrived and stood between them, he offered her a neutral smile. "I'm here to check the monitors. You're not on tonight's roster," she said calmly. "That? So." His tone was friendly, but the stare behind the smile was cold. "Must be a mix-up. I'll take it up with Dr. Holloway. Until then, step away from the room." He left without a word. That night, Lana sat in the ICU monitoring station, watching Frank's vital signs. Ranger lay unmoving, except for the occasional flick of his ears. Sunny eventually curled up and fell asleep, but only once Lana returned to the room. Outside, the storm finally broke. The clouds parted just enough to let moonlight spill into the hallway. Somewhere in the dark, Miles Tucker walked down a back corridor and out into the rain, his expression unreadable. But his mask had slipped, and Lana had seen enough to never trust a white coat again. The dim ICU room pulsed with quiet beeping, a rhythm that had become too familiar for Lana Brooks. It was now day 3 since Frank Weller had slipped into unconsciousness, and the lines on the monitor were starting to feel like a countdown. Rain no longer drummed outside. The skies had cleared, leaving behind an eerie stillness that seemed to seep into the hospital walls. Frank lay unmoving beneath a thin hospital blanket, his chest rising and falling at irregular intervals. His face remained pale, jaw clenched, as if bracing against something unseen. Lana sat by his bedside, one hand gently resting on Sonny's soft head. The golden retriever hadn't left his post, curled against Frank's legs like a loyal guardian. Ranger remained by the door, rigid eyes locked on every movement beyond the glass. It started on the second night, a slow, alarming pattern. Each time Dr. Rowe entered, Frank's vitals dipped. His oxygen levels dropped. His heart rate spiked erratically, then slowed too much. It was subtle enough to seem coincidental, but not to Lana, and not to Ranger. The third time it happened, Ranger barked violently, leaping between the doctor and Frank's bed. The shepherd's growls filled the room like thunder hackles, raised eyes blazing with a kind of primal fury. Sonny whined and nudged Frank's hand, licking gently until she froze. Lana leaned in and saw it too, a small puncture mark near Frank's index finger. Not from an IV, a fresh mark, no dressing. Just a bruise forming beneath the skin. Lana quickly retrieved gloves and carefully wiped the area. A faint residue clung to the skin, a slight shimmer, almost like oil. She used a cotton swab and sealed it in a sterile tube. Her chest tightened. Someone was poisoning him slowly, carefully. She rushed down to the station wing of the hospital, where visiting law enforcement were sometimes stationed during medical surveillance. Captain Dwayne Mercer was there, standing near the coffee machine in full uniform, his silver badge glinting beneath the fluorescent light. He looked calm, unreadable, sipping his usual black coffee from a steel mug. Lana hesitated before speaking. "Captain Mercer, I need to speak with you." "Privately?" He tilted his head. "About Weller?" "Yes. I think someone's been—" She lowered her voice, tampering with his care. "And I think it's the same man who calls himself Dr. Rowe." Mercer narrowed his eyes. He was a tall man, late 50s, neatly trimmed mustache, with a hard-lined face that rarely betrayed thought. He gestured her into the nearby conference room. "Sit," he said. Lana laid out the footage, the medical patterns, the puncture wound, and her suspicions. Mercer listened without blinking, arms crossed. When she finished, he leaned back. "And what would you have me do?" he asked. "Open an investigation, alert internal hospital security. Pull the staffing log, someone's using false credentials. We need to protect Officer Weller." Mercer tapped his mug once on the table. "You're a nurse, Miss Brooks, not a detective. Be careful not to confuse concern with accusation." Lana frowned. "You don't believe me?" He looked at her then, not with dismissal, but with something darker. "I'm saying this as a warning. People in this town are more connected than you think. Don't go sticking your nose into things you don't understand." She stared. "Are you threatening me? I'm protecting you." He stood, mug in hand. "If you value your safety and your mother's, you'll drop this." He left her there, heart hammering. That night, Lana returned to room 304. Sonny stood when she entered, tail wagging gently. Ranger approached her slowly and sat at her feet, staring up with solemn eyes. She knelt down and whispered, "I think he's one of them. Captain Mercer. He's covering for someone." She spent the next hour writing down everything: Frank's symptoms, the timeline, every odd detail she could recall about Miles Tucker, the cabin, the vials, even the make of the black sedan he'd escaped in. She copied the files to a fresh drive, hid it in a hollowed-out book in her locker, and emailed a backup to a trusted classmate from nursing school, Eva Tran, now working in Portland. Eva, a Vietnamese-American woman in her early 30s, had a reputation for stubborn honesty. With curly black hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a fearless spirit, she had once exposed a billing scandal in her own hospital. Lana trusted her. Later that night, a figure lingered at the far end of the hallway. He wore scrubs, mask on, hair covered. He passed room 304 once, twice. On the third pass, Lana stepped into the hallway. "Can I help you?" she asked. The figure stopped. He didn't speak, just stared for a moment too long before turning and disappearing into the emergency stairwell. Ranger growled low behind her. Back in the room, Frank stirred slightly. His fingers twitched, then curled faintly. Sonny perked up, tail flicking. Lana rushed to his side. "Frank, can you hear me?" His eyes didn't open, but his hand tightened around hers for just a second. She smiled through the sting of tears. "You hang in there. I've got your back." As the monitors resumed their steady rhythm, Lana looked toward the window. The town lights shimmered in the distance, faint and cold. She didn't know how deep the rot ran, but she wasn't backing down. Not now, and neither were the dogs. The storm arrived with no warning. Black clouds rolled across Ashridge like a stampede swallowing the town in darkness by mid-afternoon. Thunder cracked over the hills, and wind bent the trees low. By the time the first wave of rain slammed against the hospital windows, Lana Brooks had already done what she knew might change everything. At 2:42 p.m., she uploaded the video footage she had captured of Dr. Rowe, injecting an unmarked substance into Mr. Callahan to a secured email, and sent it to 3 local news outlets. The footage was grainy but damning. No license, no credentials, a man walking the halls in a stolen coat and a stolen name. She titled the email only, "This is happening inside Ashridge General." Then she turned off the screen and waited. Ranger had begun acting differently that morning. He hadn't barked or paced, but he wouldn't sit still either. He would walk to the door, return to Frank's side, then look at Lana and let out a low, breathy huff, as if trying to communicate something just beyond words. Sunny was more reactive. Her tail-tucked ears low, she whined and pressed her nose against the door's crack every time footsteps passed. By 3:07 p.m., the sky turned greenish-gray. The hospital lights flickered twice. Nurses hurried through the halls with uneasy glances. A heavy silence pressed in behind the wind, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then the power went out. The emergency lights buzzed on, a moment later, casting the halls in dim orange glow. Lana rushed to the ICU backup generator switchboard. Jasper Clark, the hospital's night technician, a man in his early 40s with thick glasses, pale skin, and a perpetual smell of engine oil, was already there. Jasper, soft-spoken and methodical, had worked at Ashridge General for nearly 20 years. He greeted Lana with a tense nod. "Whole grid's down," he muttered, flipping switches. "Lightning hit something big. Backup's kicking in, but it'll only last a couple hours. Tell your people to conserve." Lana returned to room 304, heart pounding. Frank remained unconscious, unmoved, but the monitor now showed irregular blips, his breathing slowing again. The machines buzzed faintly low on battery backup. Suddenly the ventilator's alarm chirped once, then stopped. A new message flashed on the screen. No respiratory effort detected. Lana froze. "No, no, no." She reached for the emergency call button. It didn't respond. The system was down. Before she could shout, Ranger stood. With a sudden leap, he sprang onto the nearby crash alarm panel and hit the large red button with his paw. The siren wailed through the corridor. Lana stared, stunned. Down the hallway, Nurse Alicia Monroe arrived in seconds. A short, round woman in her 50s with curly auburn hair and a firm grip, Alicia had worked in ERs all her life and feared nothing but wasting time. "What happened?" she barked. "He's crashing vent down. No breathing?" "I think he's been poisoned again," Lana shouted. Alicia snapped into motion, grabbing the portable respirator unit and starting manual ventilation. But Frank's oxygen was still dangerously low. Sunny, meanwhile, had begun pawing and barking at the tall supply cabinet in the corner, her tail whipped side to side in urgency. Lana blinked. "What is it, girl?" Sunny barked twice, scratched again. Lana opened the cabinet. Inside were dozens of vials color-coded by category. Sunny barked once more, her eyes fixed on a specific tray. Lana grabbed it. Inside were antitoxins. One vial was labeled with an antidote for nerve agent inhibitors, rare, but potentially fatal in small doses. Lana turned to Alicia. Try this. I found a residue on his skin days ago that matches symptoms." Alicia didn't argue. She administered a low-dose IV push and began CPR cycles. The machines remained blank for 7 seconds that stretched into forever. Then Frank gasped. It was weak and shallow, but unmistakable. Lana stumbled back, one hand over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Sunny licked Frank's face gently. Ranger stood tall, unmoving his tail, wagging once. Frank's eyes fluttered open for a moment, just long enough for Lana to see the faintest flicker of life behind them. Hours later, as the storm raged outside, backup power stabilized and the machines resumed their silent watch. Frank was sedated but stable. The poison had been real, and now finally so was the evidence. News of the leaked video began circulating online by midnight. Lana received a call from Ethan Cruz, a reporter from the Ashridge Post, who had a sharp voice and a reputation for chasing local corruption. In his early 30s, Latino, with neat black hair and always a recorder in his pocket, Ethan had once exposed a police bribery scheme in neighboring Tillamook. "I saw your footage," he said. "You want this to go public?" "Yes," Lana said without hesitation. "Then I'll need a sit-down. You'll need protection." Lana hung up, staring out into the storm-washed night. She wasn't safe, not anymore. But Frank was breathing. The truth had a voice. And she wasn't alone. Ranger curled up at Frank's feet, his head resting lightly against the man's shin. Sonny nuzzled close to his chest, sighing deeply. There were good men. And there were good dogs. Sometimes that was enough to change everything. The morning after the storm, Ashridge awoke to a quiet unlike any before. The air was still soaked in the aftermath of wind and rain, tree branches scattered across roads like broken thoughts. But something had shifted not in the weather, but in the town itself. Fear no longer lingered like a shadow behind every glance. It had a name now, and it was finally being chased. At 7:12 a.m., the Ashridge Post published the leaked footage and Lana's statement. By 8:00 a.m., it had spread statewide. Local affiliates picked up the story within the hour. The footage of a man impersonating a doctor and injecting unidentified substances into vulnerable patients alongside testimonies from a nurse, images of a police dog sounding the emergency alarm, and a coma-stricken officer suddenly recovering was too incredible to ignore. By noon, the FBI arrived in Ashridge. They came in dark SUVs, silent and swift, led by Special Agent Brian Riley, a no-nonsense man in his mid-40s, tall with broad shoulders, a square jaw, and close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair. Dressed in a navy suit with no tie, Riley exuded the tired focus of someone who'd seen too much, but hadn't yet given up on justice. He met with Lana in the hospital's private consultation room. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, voice low and even. "Your report was thorough, brave. You kept backups. 2 cloud accounts. 1 sent to my friend in Portland." She said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Riley nodded. "We have opened a full investigation. What we're seeing here may be part of a larger network distribution of experimental agents through small-town systems. Using hospitals to test or discard, Ashridge might have been a soft target." In another wing of the hospital, Miles Tucker, or whatever his real name was, walked briskly through the lower corridors, his disguise stripped down to plain scrubs, a surgical mask in his pocket. He had sensed the net closing. People were whispering. Staff were no longer so quick to nod or ignore him. He knew he had only one way out the maintenance elevator at the far end of the West Hall. He made it halfway there. As the elevator doors opened, 2 men in black stepped out. Before he could react, Agent Riley appeared behind him. "Going somewhere?" Riley said. Miles turned slowly, offering a half-smile, but the defeat was already in his eyes. "I think you have the wrong Ranger," growled. The German Shepherd had slipped out of room 304, following something only he could sense. Now his gaze locked on Miles with the intensity of a storm. Behind him, Sonny stood silently, eyes dark and unwavering. Riley nodded. "That's confirmation enough." Miles was cuffed without resistance. By mid-afternoon, Captain Dwayne Mercer was taken into custody as well. He had arrived at the hospital to check on Officer Weller, but found himself met instead by 2 federal agents with a sealed warrant and a copy of bank transfers, showing bribes linked to falsified hospital records and missing toxicology samples. His fall was quiet. No protest. Just a slow lowering of his hat and a whisper, "I thought I had more time." Back in room 304, Lana sat by Frank's side. He was conscious now, albeit groggy. A light bruising shadowed the side of his face, and his voice was barely audible. But when he opened his eyes and saw Ranger seated at attention near the foot of the bed and Sonny curled by his legs, he smiled barely. "Still watching my back?" he rasped. "Always," Lana said, brushing a tear away. Later that day, the hospital held an impromptu press conference in the lobby. Microphones cluttered the podium. Bright lights flashed from local TV crews. A small crowd of hospital staff, town residents, and even a few patients stood in quiet attention. Lana stood before them, in modest clothes, gray cardigan, dark jeans, and tired but proud eyes. Her mother, Mary Ann, sat in a wheelchair nearby, her hands trembling, but her face full of pride. Mayor Thomas Bridger, a wiry man with soft gray eyes and an old-school gentleness about him, took the mic. Today this town owes a debt of gratitude to a woman who saw something wrong and chose not to look away. Nurse Lana Brooks reminded us that truth, even when whispered, echoes louder than lies. And it is my honor on behalf of Ashridge to present her with the Medal of Civil Bravery. Lana stepped forward, cheeks flushed. She accepted the medal, glanced down at Ranger and Sonny, standing at her side, then looked out at the crowd. "I didn't do this alone," she said. "I had help from 2 incredible dogs and 1 very stubborn cop who wouldn't let a little coma stop him." The crowd laughed softly, some dabbing their eyes. Frank watched from a wheelchair just inside the doorway. A V-trailing arm in a sling, he nodded once quietly as Lana caught his gaze. Ranger stood beside him proudly, ears forward. Sonny rested her chin on his knee. Ashridge, once clouded in secrecy, now felt lighter. The hospital implemented new protocols. Security was doubled. External audits began the very week. The FBI remained in town to follow new leads, but for once the townspeople felt safe speaking up. A week later, the front page of the Ashridge Post featured a photograph of Frank Weller in his wheelchair, flanked by Ranger and Sonny with Lana kneeling beside them. The headline read, "Silent Guardians, How 2 Dogs and 1 Nurse Exposed a Town's Hidden Scars." Edo. The sun rose differently over Ashridge that morning. It was brighter somehow, casting golden rays that touched the rooftops and made the puddles from the last storm shimmer like coins tossed by the wind. The town, once caught in a quiet struggle against secrets and silence, now pulsed with a soft, cautious joy. At the edge of Maple Grove Park, Officer Frank Weller stood beneath an oak tree holding 2 leashes loosely in his hand. He had returned to duty 2 weeks ago, though his pace was slower and a slight limp lingered in his stride. A faint scar traced his temple where his head had struck the rocks, now healed, but visible beneath the brim of his cap. The beard remained, but there was a new ease in his eyes, a softening that only comes from being brought back from the edge. Beside him, Ranger, the loyal German shepherd, sat tall and composed his coat clean and brushed a new silver badge clipped proudly to his harness. His ears remained constantly alert, scanning the horizon with quiet pride. Beside him, Sonny, the golden retriever, with her signature soft gaze and feathered tail, wagged gently as children passed. She wore a blue therapy vest now, with a patch that read, "Certified Comfort Companion." Hero of Ashridge. A small crowd had gathered near the new schoolyard fence. Teachers, parents, news reporters, and laughing children surrounded a veiled statue set atop a polished stone pedestal. Mayor Thomas Bridger adjusted his microphone as the ceremony began. "Today we honor 2 of Ashridge's finest," he said, gesturing to the dogs. "Not only for their bravery, but for reminding us that loyalty and love often walk on 4 legs. The cloth dropped, revealing 2 life-sized bronze sculptures, Ranger head held high, in a pose of vigilance, and Sonny sitting at his side, with one paw slightly lifted in her trademark gentle way. Beneath their paws the plaque read, "In honor of Ranger and Sonny, guardians in silence, friends in light." Applause rang out. The children clapped the loudest, some running forward to touch the cool bronze with reverence as if the statues held magic. Behind the crowd stood Lana Brooks, her posture humble but proud. She wore a light floral blouse and dark jeans, her brown hair loose around her shoulders for once. Her mother, Mary Ann, sat beside her in a wheelchair, with a knit blanket on her lap and a small smile of peace in her expression. A tall woman in a navy blue suit stepped forward next Dr. Helen Atwood, head of the State Medical Education Board. A striking woman in her early 50s with graying curls and sharp green eyes, Dr. Atwood was known for championing rural healthcare reform. She had reviewed Lana's case personally. "Miss Brooks," she announced, "holding out an envelope for your courage, integrity, and commitment to your community. The state is awarding you the Westwood Fellowship for Advanced Clinical Research. Full tuition relocation, allowance, and immediate placement following completion. Congratulations." Lana blinked, stunned. "I didn't even apply." "You didn't have to," Dr. Atwood replied with a kind smile. "Sometimes bravery speaks louder than paperwork." Nearby, Frank gave her a single proud nod. Ranger let out a soft bark, and Sonny rolled over onto her back, expecting belly rubs. The children burst into giggles. Later that afternoon, ground broke on the edge of town, where the old train yard used to sit. Signs had gone up, future home of Sonny and Ranger's Hope Center. rescue dog training and therapy program. The land had been donated by Warren Dykes, a reclusive widower in his 70s, with a weathered face and long gray beard, who rarely left his farm but had sent a quiet note to the mayor. "Those dogs saved my nephew. I can't say it out loud, so I'll say it in land." Construction was already underway. By sunset, the park began to clear, but Frank stayed. He sat on a bench under the same oak, one arm resting across Ranger's back, the other holding a tennis ball that Sonny kept trying to steal. The golden light danced through the branches, and somewhere nearby, a child's laugh echoed, followed by the sound of a tiny bicycle bell. "Think they'll remember?" Frank asked softly. Lana sat beside him, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "They already do. You gave them more than protection. You gave them faith." He didn't respond, but the way his hand rested gently against Sonny's shoulder said enough. In the distance, the two statues gleamed in the last golden blaze of day. Frank stood and stretched, then clicked his tongue. Ranger rose instantly, eyes focused. Sonny sprang to her feet, tail swaying. Together, they began walking down the gravel path, lined with blooming daisies and new benches, past families picnicking and children running free. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field. But in that moment, Ashridge had no more shadows to fear, only light. Sometimes the ones who protect us don't wear uniforms or speak our language. They simply sit by our side, watching, feeling, knowing more than we do. In a world where silence often hides truth, loyalty and instinct can become our loudest voice. So, in your life, who stands quietly by your side when no one else sees the danger? Share this story if it touched you. Comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the unseen heroes among us. Who do you trust most when the world goes quiet? Let us know in the comments.